4 hungry children, $10 at the bottom of a cracked flour jar, and 900 days of absolute, crushing isolation under the heavy gray ceiling of the Nebraska sky. The winter of 1894 did not arrive with a gentle warning. It came with the hollow, terrifying silence of a husband who had fled in the dead of night, taking with him the only draft horse and the last remaining ounce of their family's hope. In the high plains, nature does not negotiate, and mercy is a luxury that the frozen, unyielding soil simply does not know. As the frost creeps like a pale ghost through the cracks of the sod house, neighbors with empty prayers and judgmental eyes watch from a distance, waiting for the inevitable moment when the abandoned woman will crawl to their doors to beg for crumbs or surrender her dignity. They believed the land would be her greatest challenge. They were wrong. Nebraska does not forgive weakness, but what was to come would prove that the cost of freedom is often a slow death sentence signed with one's own sweat and blood. And before I tell you what happened next, where are you watching from? City and country in the comments. It matters more than you think. To understand how Clara Miller found herself staring at a horizon that offered nothing but wind and debt, one must look back at the iron-rimmed wheels of a wagon leaving Illinois in the mud-soaked spring of 1892. They were fleeing the suffocating phantom weight of a life built on a foundation of half-finished dreams and unpaid promises. In Illinois, Silas had been a man of grand announcements, a man who spoke in the golden hues of businesses that would surely thrive and debts that would surely be settled by next harvest. But as the soil of the East grew tired and spent, so did the patience of those Silas owed. Nebraska, to Silas, was not just a promise of 160 free acres under the Homestead Act. It was a heavy curtain he intended to draw over a shameful past. For Clara, it was something different. It was a desperate, final prayer for a patch of earth that wouldn't be taken away by a sheriff's deputy. She carried with her the memory of 3 failed ventures and the hollow ache of seeing their belongings sold on a courthouse stoop. Nebraska was the last door left open. The journey westward was a slow, agonizing erosion of the human spirit. It was weeks of rhythmic, bone-deep jolts that seemed to realign the spine, the constant suffocating smell of damp canvas and unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of prairie dust that settled between the teeth like sandpaper. They arrived at the land office in a daze of fatigue, Silas clutching $120, their entire world, and a heavy, iron-breaking plow that he already looked at with more resentment than resolve. By the time their wagon creaked and groaned onto the claim, a vast, intimidating sea of waist-high blue-stem grass, Silas was already weaving the shroud of his next failure. He didn't look at the land with the eyes of a man ready to build a legacy. He looked at it with the squint of a man searching for a back exit. Even before the first wooden stake was driven into the dry earth, Silas began to narrate the difficulties to anyone who would listen, and most often to Clara. He spoke of the unyielding roots of the prairie grass that could snap an iron blade and the deceptive depth of the topsoil that hid ancient stones. Clara, standing in the relentless wind with a weary, crying infant in her arms, heard these explanations and understood them for exactly what they were. The timber framing being built around a failure that hadn't happened yet, but that Silas was already preparing to justify. The air in Nebraska is never truly still. It is a constant mournful hum that vibrates against the eardrums, a reminder that on the plains you are always being watched by the elements. The heat of that first summer was a dry, airless weight that made the lungs feel as though they were breathing in heated ash. Silas's first task was to break the sod, the thick matted carpet of roots that had held this earth together since the dawn of time. It was brutal, soul-crushing work. Every strike of the axe against the tangled roots, every lurching turn of the plow required a spiritual commitment that Silas simply did not possess. He managed to break 5 meager acres in 2 months, a pathetic fraction of what was required to sustain a family of 6, let alone satisfy the government's rigorous requirements for proving up the claim. He spent more hours sharpening the plow than he did behind the handles, complaining loudly to the wind that the steel was soft and the ground was as hard as flint. The money they had brought, money meant for seeds, for a well, for the survival of their children, began to vanish. It didn't disappear into the soil as life-giving grain, but rather into the pockets of local merchants in exchange for medicinal supplies that usually carried the sharp, biting scent of cheap rye and fermented corn. Silas had intended to be a different man in the West. He had truly believed that a change in geography would result in a change of character. But intentions are not bred, and the prairie has a cruel, surgical way of exposing the hollow spaces inside a man's soul. He thought the past had finally stopped chasing him once he crossed the Missouri River. But the prairie had a way of remembering. It remembered the way his hands shook when the work got too hard. It remembered the way he looked away when Clara's eyes asked questions he couldn't answer. By the time the first bite of autumn frost kissed the tall grass, the homestead was a skeletal testament to half-hearted effort and drifting focus. The sod house they lived in was small, damp, and lacked the proper heavy roof timbers Silas had promised to fetch from the riverbanks weeks prior. Instead, he had patched it with scrap lumber and prayers. The garden was a patchy, desperate afterthought, choked by aggressive weeds that seemed to grow with a vigor and spite that Silas utterly lacked. The children played in the gray dirt, their small faces smudged with the soot of a meager fire that struggled to stay lit against the evening chill that swept down from the north. Clara watched the sun dip below the flat, terrifying edge of the world every evening, feeling the silence of the plains growing louder and more predatory with every passing hour. She knew the rhythm of Silas's restlessness better than she knew the sound of her own heartbeat. It was a familiar ghost that had haunted their marriage across 3 different states. Silas was a man who lived exclusively in the starting, the excitement of the map, the thrill of the new horizon, but he invariably turned his back on the keeping. As the nights grew longer and the wind began to carry the sharp metallic scent of impending snow, Silas's excuses grew more elaborate, more theatrical. He spoke of the bad luck that seemed to cling to him like a burr and the gross unfairness of a land that demanded everything from a man's body and gave so little in return. He was a man drowning in a shallow pool of his own making, and Clara could feel him reaching out, clawing at her, ready to pull the rest of them down into the dark water with him. The papers in the land office looked legitimate. The name Silas Miller was written in bold, confident ink. But the truth behind those papers was something else entirely, a house of cards built on the shifting sands of a man's pride. Silas believed the land was his primary enemy. He didn't know yet that the hardest part of the frontier wasn't the breaking of the sod or the howling of the wolves. It was the reflection he saw in his wife's eyes every time he laid down the plow before the sun had even reached its zenith. The first cracks were appearing, not just in the cooling mud walls of their sod house, but in the very foundation of their survival as a family. And the Nebraska winter was coming, a season that doesn't just bring the cold, it brings the final unvarnished truth of who you really are. What happened next would follow Clara for the rest of her life, staining her memories with the scent of wood smoke and betrayal. But before the first snow fell, Silas had one more intention to share, the one that would finally break the world they had tried to build. He didn't know it yet, but the prairie was done waiting for him to become the man he claimed to be. By the spring of 1893, the novelty of the frontier had been burned away by a relentless sun, replaced by a weary, grinding repetition that threatened to hollow out the soul. Survival in the sandhills of Nebraska was not a single heroic act. It was 1,000 small, back-breaking chores that began before the light touched the horizon and ended long after the coyotes began their nightly lament. For Clara, life had become a balance sheet of dwindling resources and rising desperation. Every bucket of water hauled from the shallow, hand-dug well felt like a withdrawal from a bank account that was dangerously close to zero. The filing fee at the land office had cost them $14, a small price for a future, Silas had claimed at the time. But the hidden costs were the ones that truly bled them. A bushel of seed wheat cost nearly $1. A simple iron shovel, another $2. Every tool that snapped under the pressure of the root-choked earth was a catastrophe. Silas had spent the winter months talking about the grand barn he would raise once the thaw came, but as the prairie lilies began to bloom, the only structure he had managed to complete was a leaning, drafty corral made of scavenged scrap wood and desperation. Clara's days were a blurred sequence of labor. She spent hours stooped over the small garden plot, her fingernails perpetually stained black with the rich, heavy soil she fought to keep moist. She planted rows of potatoes, turnips, and cabbage, the heavy, unglamorous crops that could survive a cellar storage and a hungry winter. Her hands, once soft from a life in the settled East, were now a map of scars and calluses, the skin cracked from the lye soap she used to scrub the endless prairie grit from their clothes. The wind, she realized, was an intruder that respected no walls. It carried the fine alkaline dust into their food, their bedding, and the very lungs of her children. Silas, however, had found a different way to cope with the silence of the plains. The medicinal rye he had brought during the first winter had become a permanent resident of his coat pocket. He spent more time at the general store in the distant township, a grueling 6-hour journey, than he did in the fields. He would return with grand stories of market fluctuations and railroad expansions, his breath smelling of fermented bitterness and his eyes unfocused, unable to meet Clara's steady, accusing gaze. He was breaking, not the sod, but the unspoken contract of their marriage. The loneliness was a physical weight, a ringing in the ears that never truly subsided. Their nearest neighbor, a stern Swedish family named Lindgren, lived 4 miles to the north. Interaction was rare, limited to a stiff nod at the land office or a brief exchange of pleasantries at the rare Sunday service held in a sod schoolhouse. In the absence of human voices, the prairie spoke in a language of rustling grass and creaking timbers. It was a landscape that made one feel small, insignificant, a speck of dust on the back of a vast, sleeping animal that might wake up and shake you off at any moment. To supplement their meager income, Clara began a grueling routine that Silas considered beneath their dignity. She gathered the scattered eggs from their small flock of scrawny chickens and spent hours churning cream into pale, salted butter. Every 2 weeks, she would load the children into the wagon and make the long trek to the settlement to trade these small offerings for essentials: salt, coal oil, and cotton thread. The merchant, a man with eyes like cold pebbles, would weigh her butter with a skepticism that made Clara's throat tighten with shame. Each penny earned was a victory won against the odds, a thin barrier between her children and the gnawing belly of hunger. But the money Silas was supposed to be saving for the autumn seed was slowly leaking away. She found the empty bottles hidden beneath the floorboards of the sod house, tucked away like shameful secrets. When she confronted him, Silas didn't offer an apology. He offered more excuses. He blamed the stifling atmosphere of the claim, the unbearable pressure of the government's requirements, and the hostility of a land that seemed to reject his every effort. He was a man who saw a conspiracy in the weather and a personal insult in a broken plow. He believed the land would eventually yield to his desires without him having to yield to its demands. She was wrong. She had hoped that the responsibility of the homestead would forge him into a leader. Instead, it was acting as a crucible, burning away his illusions and leaving only the dross of his character. Every night, the silence between them in the cramped earthen room was thicker than the mud walls that sheltered them. By mid-August, a heat wave descended upon the Nebraska plains that felt like the opening of a furnace door. The grass turned a brittle, sickly yellow, and the air shimmered with a heat that distorted the horizon. The small creek at the edge of their property slowed to a muddy trickle, then vanished entirely. Silas sat in the shade of the wagon, staring at the withered stalks of the few acres of corn he had bothered to plant, his hands idle, his spirit already vanished into the bottom of a bottle. It was during these suffocating, breathless days that the foreshadowing of their ruin became undeniable. The wind shifted to the south, carrying with it a dry, parched scent that spoke of distant fires and dying crops. Silas had stopped talking about the future altogether. He had retreated into a surly, defensive shell, his movements erratic and his temper as short as the scorched grass. He began to look at the draft horse, Barnaby, the only thing of real value they had left, with a strange, calculating glint in his eye. Clara didn't know it yet, but the intentions that Silas had carried across the Missouri River were about to reach their final, devastating conclusion. The prairie had been patient, watching the man fail bit by bit, day by day. But the seasons were turning, and the grace period offered by the summer was coming to an end. The loop was about to close, and the price of Silas's cowardice was a debt that Clara would be forced to pay in full. The hardest part wasn't the work, she whispered to herself as she tucked the children into their thin blankets. It was being watched, by the neighbors who expected her to fail, by the land that demanded her sweat, and by the husband who was already planning his escape from the very life he had forced her to embrace. Winter hadn't arrived yet, but it was already in the air, a cold promise of the betrayal that was waiting just over the next ridge. The transition from late autumn to early winter in Nebraska is not a gradual fading of warmth. It is a violent theft of color and life. By mid-October of 1893, the sky had turned the color of bruised iron, and the wind had sharpened into a blade that searched for every gap in the sod walls. The prairie, once a sea of gold, was now a jagged, frozen wasteland of brittle stalks. Inside the small earthen home, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the unsaid. Clara moved with a mechanical precision, mending wool socks by the dim light of a flickering tallow candle, her ears tuned to the heavy, uneven breathing of Silas in the corner. He had stopped pretending to work weeks ago. The iron plow sat in the middle of the field, half buried by the first dusting of snow, a tombstone for his stalled ambitions. Silas had retreated into a volatile silence, broken only by the sharp clink of a glass bottle against the floorboards. Clara could feel the storm brewing inside him, a storm far more dangerous than the one gathering over the Rockies. He was a man who had reached the end of his excuses, and for a man like Silas, that was an intolerable place to be. The rupture occurred on a morning so cold the air seemed to crack when you breathed it. It was the kind of cold that turns the marrow to ice and makes the very wood of the wagon groan in protest. Clara woke before dawn, the silence of the house weighing on her chest like a physical stone. She reached out across the thin mattress, her hand meeting only the cold, rough fabric of the wool blanket. Silas was gone. At first, she told herself he had gone to check the traps, or perhaps to the well. But as she stepped outside, the gray light of a Nebraska winter morning revealed a devastation that no words could soften. The stable door swung open on a broken hinge, creaking in the wind like a mourning bell. Barnaby, their only draft horse, their engine of survival, their connection to the world, was gone. The wagon had been pillaged. The small chest where they kept their emergency funds had been pried open, its lid hanging uselessly. Silas hadn't just left. He had performed an act of surgical betrayal. He had taken the horse, the saddle, the heavy coat Clara had made for him, and every cent of the seed money they had struggled to save. He had traded the lives of his wife and 4 children for a chance to run away from his own shadow. Clara stood in the middle of the yard, the wind whipping her hair across her face, staring at the fresh hoofprints in the light snow that led toward the southern horizon. He had fled toward the warmth, toward the towns, toward a life where no one knew his name or his failures. She walked back into the sod house, her movements slow and numb. She went to the flour jar, the small blue-rimmed ceramic pot where she hid her butter money for the children's shoes. She reached her hand deep into the white dust and pulled out a small, crumpled roll of paper. $10. $10 and a handful of copper pennies were all that remained to sustain 5 souls through a winter that was just beginning. The weight of it was enough to crush the lungs. She looked at her 4 children, Abigail, the eldest, already awake and watching her mother with eyes that understood far too much for a 12-year-old. The younger ones were still huddled under the quilts, their breath puffing in small white clouds in the freezing air. For a moment, a single, terrifying moment, Clara felt the urge to simply lie down in the dirt and let the cold take them. It would be easy. It would be a surrender to the very fate Silas had written for them. But as she looked at Abigail, she saw a reflection of her own jawline, a stubborn, unyielding strength that had been forged in the very crucible Silas had fled. She realized then that the land was not her enemy. The neighbors were not her enemy. Even the winter was not her enemy. The enemy was the belief that she was helpless without the man who had abandoned her. "Your father isn't coming back," Clara said, her voice flat and steady, cutting through the silence of the room. It wasn't a lament. It was a statement of fact. Abigail didn't cry. She simply nodded and began to stoke the small fire. The isolation of the next few days was a psychological torture. The horizon was a perfect, unbroken circle of gray. There were no travelers, no riders, no help. In Nebraska, a woman without a horse was a woman on an island of grass. She spent the first week in a state of hypervigilance, half expecting Silas to crest the ridge, broken and repentant. But as the days turned into a week and the week into two, the truth settled into her bones like the frost. He was gone, and he had taken their future with him. The curiosity gap that had haunted her for months, the question of what Silas was truly capable of, had been answered with a cruelty she hadn't dared to imagine. He didn't just leave, he robbed them of their ability to leave. He had turned their homestead into a prison. By late November, the first true blizzard screamed across the plains. The wind hammered at the sod walls, searching for a way in, whistling through the scrap lumber roof that Silas had never finished. They spent 3 days huddled together in the center of the room, burning twisted bundles of dried prairie grass and cow chips for warmth, the smoke stinging their eyes and clinging to their skin. Every hour was a battle to keep the fire alive, to keep the children's spirits from breaking. In the middle of the storm, Clara found herself staring at the iron-breaking plow through the small, frosted window pane. It stood out there, half obscured by the driving snow, a useless hunk of metal without a horse to pull it. Silas had said the land was too hard. He had said the roots were too deep. He had said it was impossible for a man to succeed here. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to prove him wrong in a way that would rewrite the history of that patch of earth. She realized that Silas hadn't failed because of the land. He had failed because he was a man of intentions, and the prairie only respects completion. The loop of his cowardice had closed, but Clara was about to open a new one, a loop of survival that would require a price she wasn't sure she could pay, but one she was willing to sign in blood if necessary. And that was when she heard the faint, rhythmic sound of a bell through the howling wind. It wasn't a hallucination. It was the sound of a neighbor's cow, lost in the storm and wandering near their fence line. It was a sign of life. And for Clara, it was the first spark of a plan that would change everything. The worst had happened. The betrayal was complete. Now, the real work was about to begin. By the time the last echoes of the November blizzard faded, the silence that settled over the Miller homestead was no longer one of peace, but of a grim, tactical necessity. Clara did not spend her mornings weeping for the man who had stolen their future. She spent them counting beans and measuring the remaining coal oil. The first true test of her resolve came in the gray light of early December, when the hunger of her children began to outweigh her pride. The journey to the Lindgren farm, 4 miles to the north, was a walk through a white purgatory. Without a horse, every mile was a battle against the thigh-high drifts and the wind that felt like 1,000 needles against the skin. When she finally arrived, shivering and frostbitten, at the sturdy wooden door of the Swedish family, the reception was as cold as the landscape. Mr. Lindgren, a man whose life was measured in straight lines and rigid scripture, looked at Clara not with sympathy, but with the weary suspicion one reserves for a failing investment. In the eyes of the community, an abandoned woman was a liability, a crack in the collective hull of their survival. Lindgren didn't offer charity, and Clara didn't ask for it. Instead, she proposed a bargain that made the old farmer pause. She offered her own labor and that of her eldest daughter, Abigail, for the entirety of the spring planting and autumn harvest, in exchange for the loan of a team of mules and enough seed wheat to fill their broken acres. It was a contract of sweat. Lindgren, seeing an opportunity for cheap, desperate labor, agreed with a curt nod that felt more like a sentence than a mercy. The work that followed in the spring of 1894 was a brutal symphony of iron and bone. To break the Nebraska sod without a man's strength was considered a fool's errand, but Clara and Abigail became a single, driven machine. While Abigail led the mules, struggling to keep the stubborn animals in a straight line, Clara threw her entire weight against the handles of the breaking plow. The iron blade shrieked as it tore through the ancient matted roots of the blue-stem grass. The very roots Silas had claimed were unyielding. Her shoulders became a constant knot of pain. Her hands, once scarred, were now permanently clawed from gripping the wood. Every inch of soil turned was a victory over the ghost of Silas. By mid-April, they had turned more earth in 3 weeks than Silas had in 2 years. But the land wasn't the only thing testing them. The social pressure began to mount like a rising tide. Twice, the local circuit rider, a man of God with a voice like gravel, visited the sod house, not to offer help, but to suggest that Clara give up this vanity and find a household where she could serve as a domestic, perhaps letting her children be fostered out to more stable families. He spoke of the natural order and the burden of a woman alone. Clara listened in silence, her eyes fixed on the horizon until he finished. She didn't argue with theology. She simply pointed to the 15 acres of freshly turned black earth and asked him if he had ever seen a natural order that looked more like honest work than that. The pressure stacking was relentless. In May, a late frost threatened to kill the tender shoots of their garden, the potatoes and turnips that were their only insurance against starvation. Clara and Abigail spent 48 hours without sleep, hauling heavy buckets of water and building small, smoking fires around the perimeter of the patch to keep the ice at bay. They moved like shadows through the mist, their faces blackened by soot, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. They saved the crop, but the cost was a deep, rattling cough that settled into Abigail's chest for a month. Money was a phantom they chased through the sale of every possible resource. Clara began walking the 7 miles to the railway settlement twice a week, carrying baskets of eggs and crocks of butter that she had churned until her arms felt like lead. She sold the butter for 12 cents a pound, every penny destined for the land office fund. She watched the townspeople, women in clean calico and men with polished boots, look at her as she passed. She was the Miller woman, a cautionary tale whispered over tea. She carried their judgment like a stone in her pocket, heavy but familiar. Choices had costs, even when they were the right ones, the narrator's voice reflects, slow and sober. And the hardest part for Clara wasn't the weight of the plow or the sting of the frost. It was the crushing weight of being misunderstood by those who mistook her silence for defeat. By June, the heat returned, a searing reminder of the summer that had broken Silas. But this time, the homestead looked different. The stable, once a leaning ruin, had been reinforced with scavenged stone and mud. The garden was a lush, defiant green against the tan of the prairie. The children, though thin, moved with a purpose, helping to haul water and tend the few chickens they had left. Yet the tension was escalating. A local land speculator, a man named Henderson, who smelled of expensive tobacco and opportunism, began riding past their fence line. He knew the law. He knew that for Clara to prove up the claim, she had to show a completed house and a specific acreage of cultivation by the 5-year mark. He began to drop hints at the general store that a woman alone could never meet the government's rigorous inspection. He was waiting for her to stumble, his checkbook ready to buy the land for a fraction of its value the moment the inspector turned her away. Clara felt his presence like a vulture circling overhead. Every night she sat by the doorway of the sod house, her shotgun across her knees, watching the shadows. She wasn't just guarding her chickens, she was guarding her dignity. She had learned that the prairie didn't care who you used to be, but the people on it never forgot. She was fighting 2 wars, one against the soil and one against the expectation of her own failure. She believed the land would be the hardest part. She was wrong. The land was beginning to yield to her touch, turning from a dry enemy into a fertile partner. The real threat was the human element, the whispers, the speculators, and the looming shadow of the government inspector who was due to arrive in less than a year. As the first heat lightning of July danced on the horizon, Clara stood in the middle of her wheat field, the green stalks brushing against her waist. She thought of Silas, somewhere far away, probably telling someone in a bar about his bad luck in Nebraska. She didn't hate him anymore. She didn't have the energy for it. She only had energy for the next row, the next bucket, the next day. The loop of survival was tightening, and the climax of her 5-year struggle was drawing near. The question wasn't whether she could do the work. She had already proven that. The question was whether the world would allow her to keep what she had earned. The final year of the 5-year requirement arrived not with a celebration, but with a silence so profound it felt like the prairie itself was holding its breath. By June of 1894, the Miller homestead had become a landmark of quiet defiance in central Nebraska. Where Silas had seen too much grass, There were now 23 acres of golden wheat and sturdy corn, their leaves rustling like the pages of a well-read book. Where Silas had left a leaning ruin, there stood a stable reinforced with stone, a deep root cellar stocked with the insurance of 1,000 meals, and a sod house that had weathered storms that broke stronger men. Yet, as the date for the final proving up approached, the physical exhaustion finally caught up with Clara. One evening, after the children had fallen asleep, she sat on the dirt floor of the cabin, her back against the cool mud wall, and she wept. They were not the tears of a victim, but the tears of a soldier who has forgotten what it feels like to not be at war. She looked at her hands, gnarled, stained, and trembling, and for a brief, terrifying moment, the ghost of Silas's voice returned. "It's too hard, Clara. The land is too hard. The isolation, the years of being the abandoned woman, and the constant threat of speculators like Henderson had hollowed her out." She felt a crushing sensation that despite everything she had built, a single stroke of an inspector's pen could still take it all away because she was a woman without a husband in a world that demanded both. But the moment of break was also her moment of clarity. She realized that she wasn't waiting for a man to save the farm. She had already saved it. The cost had been her youth, her softness, and her standing in a judgmental society, but the prize was a freedom that no one could ever bargain away again. The day the government inspector arrived, the air was shimmering with a heat that made the horizon dance. He was a thin man with a dusty suit and a ledger that seemed to weigh more than his conscience. He didn't look at Clara's tired eyes. He looked at the height of the corn. He didn't ask about Silas. He measured the depth of the well. He walked the perimeter of the 15-acre field, his boots crunching on the dry earth, while Henderson, the speculator, watched from his horse at the edge of the road like a vulture waiting for a signal. The inspector returned to the shade of the sod house, where Clara stood with Abigail and the 3 younger children. He flipped through his papers, the scratching of his pen the only sound in the vast silence of the plains. The law requires a head of household to show evidence of permanent residence and successful cultivation, the inspector said, his voice devoid of emotion. He looked up, his gaze finally meeting Clara's. He saw the scars on her hands and the iron in her posture. He looked past her to the fields that Silas had once called worthless. "I see 23 acres of crop," the man continued. "I see a stable, a corral, a cellar, and a family that is still standing. The record shows a filing by a Clara Miller in 1892, but the evidence shows a homestead finished by a Clara Miller." He didn't ask where Silas was. In the brutal logic of the frontier, a man who isn't there to hold the plow doesn't exist. With a deliberate motion, he stamped the document. He didn't issue it to the name on the original filing. He issued it to Clara Miller, head of household. When the inspector's buggy pulled away, and Henderson finally turned his horse and rode off into the dust of his own defeated greed, Clara didn't cheer. She simply walked to the center of the wheat field and let the stalks brush against her palms. The patent would arrive in the mail months later, a single page of government paper that hangs today in a small county museum. It doesn't explain how a deserted mother with 4 children and $10 proved up a claim in the middle of a wasteland. It doesn't need to. The explanation was the land itself, still there, still worked, still yielding. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is choose a difficult freedom over a comfortable constraint. Clara had learned that some loneliness is clean, the kind that comes from standing your ground, while the other kind, the kind Silas carried, stains you from the inside out. She had traded a marriage of excuses for a life of completion. The Miller homestead remained in the family for 3 generations. Abigail grew up to be a farmer herself, never once asking a man for permission to touch the soil. The younger son served his country, and the middle daughter became a teacher, telling the story of the woman who broke the sod when the world told her to break her spirit instead. The prairie didn't care who Clara used to be. It only cared what she could endure. And in the end, the land didn't just belong to her. She belonged to the land. The story of the American West is often told through the boots of men who rode into the sunset. But the real history, the one that endured, was written in the calluses of the women who stayed behind to finish what those men started. Clara Miller is a footnote, a ghost of an intention. Clara Miller is the soil itself. Have you ever chosen a path that everyone told you was impossible, simply because the alternative was losing yourself? Share your story in the comments. I want to hear about the homesteads you've built in your own life, against the odds.